Mental Maps is brought to you by Well. Well is a virtual holistic mental health service providing psychiatric evaluations, holistic interventions, and when needed, medication management. For more information, check out Well at www.arukawell.co. That's www.arukawell.co. Welcome back to Mental Maps. As always, I hope this finds you well no matter what season of life you're in. Today, we're continuing our discussion on minerals. So if you're just jumping into this show or you just kind of stumbled upon Mental Maps itself, we've been in a series discussing how minerals impact brain health. And so that we have some episodes on magnesium and zinc. And so I definitely recommend you go back and check those out if you haven't yet. However, you don't have to listen to those to listen to this episode today. So don't turn this off and go to listen to those. But when this is over, go listen to those, right? What we're going to talk about today is probably the most well-known mineral in the concept of health. That is iron, right? I think we all remember learning about iron in school. Many people are very wildly aware of iron, right? Maybe because of my other physical health issues. And so what we're going to talk about today is how iron not only is wildly important for your brain health and mental health, but it's also could be the driver to why you're feeling unwell. And so we're going to kind of talk about that today. So as we jump into iron, what we're going to do is introduce probably our first mineral we've discussed that you can have too much of. Now, you definitely can have too much magnesium and zinc, but the body really does a good job of kind of regulating that. However, iron itself, you can become very ill if you have too much iron. And we know there's actually conditions where there is too much iron in the body. And we'll talk about those in a minute. So as we get into iron, iron is really based on homeostasis, right? Meaning that we don't have too much, we don't have not enough, that we kind of have that middle ground, right? That Goldilocks effect, if you will. And that's kind of what you're looking for in the world of iron. Iron is important across the body, right? Everything from oxygen transport to cell respiration to immunity, and in our world, making neurotransmitters. So you see it involved in so many different concepts. There's even, in the world of iron, we know that there is a disorder that's very well known. That's called anemia. Anemia is when you don't have enough iron. And we see numerous symptoms of that, right? Some that kind of remind you of depression, some that remind you of anxiety, but you see this fatigue, this weakness, this tiredness, but then probably the telltale is the pica, right? Where you're just eating abnormal things, which is its own thing, which we'll talk about that in a little bit. But that's kind of what makes anemia pretty interesting. But in our world, in the world of mental health, iron is really important in making neurotransmitters. And so we'll talk about that in a little bit. So we'll talk about that right now. So in the world of iron, right, iron will help create not only dopamine, but norepinephrine and serotonin, right? So one of the things that happens with neurotransmitters, we talked about it on this show before, is neurotransmitters just don't pop out of thin air. There is this really important process that occurs that has numerous factors and cofactors. Cofactors meaning that this needs to happen for A to go to B, right? And iron is a cofactor to many of these neurotransmitters. So for example, when we're making dopamine in our body, it starts with a amino acid called tyrosine. Tyrosine is converted over to L-DOPA, and L-DOPA is converted to dopamine, and then dopamine makes norepinephrine. Iron is important to get tyrosine to L-DOPA, meaning that if I don't have enough iron in my body, tyrosine cannot convert to L-DOPA, which can't convert to dopamine, right? Another example of this is with serotonin. So we know that there's a method to serotonin, right? There's a amino acid called tryptophan. Tryptophan goes to 5-HTP, and 5-HTP then goes into serotonin. And I know that sounds very biology, chemistry kind of stuff, but hang with me because this is important. Because in the world of serotonin, iron is important for tryptophan to go into 5-HTP, which then makes serotonin. So your entire neurotransmitter system that we talk about in pop culture, dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, if you don't have enough iron, you're not going to be able to make enough of them, which ultimately can lead to numerous issues, right? We know that the depression itself is not related to not having enough of a neurotransmitter, but we do know there are conditions like dopamine deficiency or like an absence of serotonin that does cause a version of depression, right? We also see where iron is involved in something called monoamine oxidase, which is a enzyme that helps break down too many neurotransmitters. And so we see where this is also disrupted when iron is disrupted, meaning it's breaking down an excess amount of serotonin and dopamine, right? At the same time, it disrupts glutamate, which we've been talking about so much in the world of the minerals, as well as GABA. So this entire neurotransmitter system, right? This whole concept that we talk about in the world of medicine and with therapy and all of it can all be disrupted because of iron, right? So unlike what we talked about with magnesium and zinc, where it's really involved in maybe like one specific receptor set, here we're talking about the formation of these neurotransmitters, which is wild. We see where iron is highly concentrated in certain parts of the brain, primarily in the basal ganglia. And so I know that sounds super biology, but what's really cool about that is that's where dopamine and GABA is metabolized, right? So our neurotransmitter that's important for joy, happiness, euphoria, motivation, and drive, and our neurotransmitter that's important for calming and regulating mood, iron is highly concentrated in the areas that are making those. And ultimately, the basal ganglia in itself is very important for behavior organization, right? Meaning how you organize and get your behavior going, which is one of the reasons we see where anemia has so much fatigue involved in not being able to do things, right? So we have this mineral. This mineral is helping make numerous neurotransmitters in our body, right? And that's then regulating our overall mood. And so we see where in people who have low iron, there is a profound altered dopamine and serotonin that's occurring in our body. Now, there is some conflicting evidence on the world of serotonin, primarily because of the way it's made, but the dopamine is pretty consistent through literature, right? We see not only is there not enough dopamine in those areas, but we also see where the receptors for dopamine will actually down-regulate, meaning that the brain recognizes that it doesn't have enough of those neurotransmitters. So it decreases the amount of receptors there are because it feels like it doesn't need it. Think about that for a second, right? That's so wild that this neurotransmitter that's important for joy and motivation and all the things that we kind of think of from drive. If my iron is low, not only do I not have enough of them, but my brain will even get rid of some of the receptors that's needed for them just because it recognizes they're not there, which is wild, right? And so in our world, we primarily focus on low iron, right? Or what's called anemia. It's estimated that about 2 billion people worldwide have anemia. We see this primarily in children and like menstruating women. And within that, it can be primarily due to food and diet, which we'll talk about in a little bit. There's also some medical conditions that can cause that as well. But the deficiency is worldwide. And it's quite an epidemic with, especially in certain parts of the world, where you see not enough iron being consumed, right? What's really interesting about iron is the effect that it has on the brain is really based on when the emergence of the issue happens, right? So the timing of it, how long it occurs, and then how severe it is really impacts the outcome, right? So we see where in young infants and toddlers with low iron, they're more likely to have brain development issues and they have problems with intellectual functioning later on. Whereas we see as an adult or maybe as a teenager, it's more mood issues and behavior issues. So when we're looking at people, we're recognizing not only is this affecting the person now, but it very well could be affecting the person for years to come, primarily in kids because of the impact of how the brain is developing, right? In the world of psychiatry, we really see a couple diagnoses, if you will, or what we call like experiences that are involved in the world of iron, right? We really see it involved in depression, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of the research that goes into that. We see it involved in anxiety, right? And then we also see it involved in the world of like schizophrenia. And what we see in the world of iron is two concepts, right? We see one with this hypoexcitable, body is turned down, weakness, fatigue, unable to do things, right? But we also see it, and this is kind of what's interesting, some hyperexcitability, which is kind of new in the world of what we've been talking about on this show, where you can see people for whatever reason, their iron disruptions lead to an increase in fearfulness. It can lead to chest pain. It can lead to feeling kind of activated, but primarily you see the weakness. In the world of anxiety, there's some pretty good literature to show us there's an increase in fearfulness, right? We see where the amygdala becomes kind of hyperactive for people with low iron. Some believe it has to do with your body is recognizing that it's not in a safe state. Others believe it has to do with just where that iron is concentrated at in the brain. Either way, it's an increase in fearfulness, if you will. Physically, you see the weakness like we talked about in anemia, or like we talked about for the physical symptoms of anemia. You see chest pain, you see brittle nails, you see cold hands and feet, you see headaches. So many times with low iron, it's not just I feel anxious or depressed. There's many times a physical symptom that occurs with it because iron is involved in so much, right? In a point, there is this concept of iron overload, right? So we talked about how you cannot have enough iron, but sometimes we can have too much iron. There's a gamut of reasons why this occurs. We know that iron levels will naturally increase as we get older, right? Because ultimately iron's core functioning is helping transport oxygen throughout the body, right? And so within that, as we get older, we know we need more oxygen. Maybe we're having issues with our breathing. And so our body will attempt to make more iron to negate that. We see where when iron becomes really elevated, you'll see cell and tissue damage in the brain, right? So not only at the cellular level, when we see damage there, but we'll also see tissues that are damaged. And we also see high iron related into neurodegenerative diseases, right? Like dementia and some of those others, where there is a belief that some people will form dementia for having too much iron, because the iron in itself is damaging. It creates this oxidative stress, right? Meaning that it's bringing too much oxygen there or not enough, but it's impacting your overall cellular health and creating this damage, right? We've also seen where iron overload, there's some cases where it relates in the world of schizophrenia, right? We talk a lot about how mental health disorders, if you will, are on a spectrum, right? And schizophrenia specifically is on a spectrum. And there is a belief that there's a version of schizophrenia that has to do with iron overload, right? We see people who have iron overload are more likely to form post-traumatic stress disorder. There's some literature that kind of shows us that those people with really high amounts of iron struggle to respond to traumatic experiences, right? So you see where we have low iron, which is this hypoexcitable, not able to get up, not able to get going, weakness, or an increase in fearfulness. Or we have iron overload, where you start seeing issues with cognition, you start having problems where you're beginning to maybe like hear things and see things in the world of schizophrenia. Maybe you have problems with just feeling really up and elevated, right? That hyper excitable experience because the body is very over excited because of the too much iron. And that's kind of what you see there. So I guess the first I guess what we can go with in this world of iron would be, why does this happen? How does our iron get off? As we talk about with most iron, most minerals and vitamins, the telltale is our food, right? We believe that that's kind of the biggest driver in the world of this epidemic that's occurring worldwide, is this experience with food issues. We know that iron is primarily in like shellfish. We see it in red meat and organ meats. We see it in legumes and pumpkin seeds. It's really highly concentrated there. We'll even post something on our social media page, on the Ruka Well page, of the iron compared to the food, right? And we see where you can get a ton of iron from like red meat, you can get a ton of iron from shellfish. For the people who don't consume meat, they try to get this from their spinach and their leafy greens. And to a point, I'm not saying you have to eat meat. We'll talk about that in a second. But we know that the iron that exists in spinach and leafy greens is what's called non-heme bound iron, meaning it's iron that's not based on hemoglobin, right? And so because of that, that iron is not very well absorbed. And so you see people have to consume mass amounts of spinach and other leafy greens to get the iron that they need. And that's why many people who, live a vegan or a vegetarian lifestyle have to supplement with iron, because if not, it's just almost impossible to get what they need. If they get their legumes, they can kind of take that over, right? You see this in other parts of the world where the meat's not widely available, parts of the Nicoya Peninsula and other areas where the legumes are able to take it over. But if you're not eating that, you're really struggling to get that in. We know that iron itself needs to be paired with vitamin C. Iron and vitamin C are best friends, right? They're hanging out on weekends. They are tight. And because of that, vitamin C will increase the absorption of iron. And so you'll see where for people who are struggling to get enough iron, you want to pair maybe some citrus fruits, some bell peppers, some strawberries with that food you're consuming to help increase the amount of iron absorption, right? So a perfect example is someone who takes some bell peppers, puts it in the meat they're eating, and maybe makes a taco with it, maybe makes a salad with it. Now you're going to be able to elevate that, right? Or maybe eat your citrus fruit after you eat your meat, being able to elevate that. At the same time, you need to avoid certain foods that impact the absorption of iron. We know tea and coffee and more like calcium rich foods, as well as like whole grains, will impact the way your body absorbs iron. So if I'm struggling with iron or I'm having iron issues, I probably don't need to be eating my meat with whole grains. I probably don't need to be eating my meat or whatever I'm consuming with my morning coffee or whatever that looks like, because it's impacting the absorption, right? So prioritizing your vitamin C with your iron to ensure you're getting it the way you need to, and limiting the amount of those whole grains, coffee, tea, calcium rich foods so they don't impact your absorption. The cool thing about iron is we can measure it. It's really easy to measure. Many healthcare providers will measure it for you. You measure it on ferritin, right? And so for my healthcare providers out there, the people who are going to be getting labs done, you're really looking at about 100 nanograms a milliliter. You also want to look at something called transferrin, as well as like total iron binding capacity. There's actually an entire iron panel you can do. And I know some specialists that do that kind of work. And so you can check that out as well. But what you're really going to start with is the ferritin, right? That's a way to kind of show the iron in your body. We believe that less than 30 nanograms a milliliter of ferritin means you are iron deficient, right? So we know the normal range is 100, or we like for you to be at 100. You get below 30, you're deficient. However, if you don't feel well and you're kind of on that lower end of the threshold, you probably need to be doing something, right? Because if you feel great at 70 nanograms a milliliter, more power to you, man. But if you don't feel good, you need to optimize that, right? And that's why it's so cool to work with a healthcare provider or someone that can help you see what your iron levels are, right? We know in females, this shifts a lot, primarily related to menstruation. So it's just something to be very aware of, right? If you're a healthcare provider and you're pulling that, I think we all remember that from school. But if not, just remembering where you're at in your cycle, maybe pulling it numerous times in that month just to kind of see what that fluctuation looks like is pretty important, right? But for many people, whether it's something to do with their food, access to food, food choices, or maybe even with the food, they're just having problems getting it, iron supplementation is really where you end up going to optimize your iron, right? What I think is really interesting about iron supplementation is it's wildly dependent on a lot of different things. And so first and foremost, you need to ensure you're consuming it on an empty stomach. We believe there's about a 40% decrease in absorption with food, right? So if you got your iron supplement, you're taking that in the morning with your morning breakfast, there's a good chance you're going to decrease your absorption by around 40%, which stinks because a lot of times iron is known to cause some GI issues. We'll talk about that in a minute, but you really need to try your best to consume that on an empty stomach. In the world of supplementation, as we've been talking about with all these irons or all these minerals, it's about the binders, right? And the binders really help you dictate how you're going to use these. In the world of iron, there's two types of irons. There's iron ferrous and ferric, right? Or FRROUS or FERRIC, right? That's kind of what you'll see on your ingredient labels. We know ferrous is probably the most well known. You'll see where ferrous sulfate or gluconate are really two really popular ones. In the ferric world, you see it more citrate and sulfate, right? So I know that can sound very chemistry driven, but if you go back to like our magnesium and zinc, you'll kind of be like, oh, I remember some of these terminologies that we're talking about. We know the ferrous is absorbed faster and easier, right? So we kind of prefer that in the world of supplementation. Both salt compounds are known to cause those GI issues, but the ferrous is easier, right? So it's better absorbed, and so many times that's what you're looking at. The gold standard in supplementation many times is the ferrous bisglycinate. You know, we talked a lot about glycinate on this show and how glycinate really makes it a lot easier for it to get into the body. And so that's just iron with 2 glycine chemicals added to it, right? It's the best absorbed, it's the best tolerated. And for a long time, the gold standard was 60 milligrams twice a day. But now there was some new research that came out 6 years ago by Ning and colleagues that says maybe 60 milligrams every other day. And the reason for that is decreasing the amount that you're consuming day in and day out in the supplement improves the absorption, right? And so there is something to be said for maybe starting out at 60 milligrams every other day, seeing how you respond to that. If your levels don't get up, maybe you change the way you're consuming it. But that new evidence by those hematologists are really important in how we're kind of driving the iron car right now, if you will. When we consume iron, if you remember, what do we need? Vitamin C, right? And so a lot of times you're going to supplement vitamin C with it. I'm a big believer of putting 100 milligrams of vitamin C with your iron. There's really solid research into that. So you have your iron supplement, you have that biglycinate supplementation, 60 milligrams twice a day. And then with it, you're going to take that vitamin C, 100 milligrams is kind of where you want to start, right? That is what your supplementation is going to look like. Ultimately, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, it's most important to work with a healthcare provider trying to get this leveled out. But if you're having issues with iron, you definitely want to work this through, right? If you're a female and you're finding yourself, having some issues or big dips, especially related to your menses, really prioritizing your iron consumption around that time, right? We know you lose a lot of iron during certain times of the month. And so what does it look like to really prioritize your red meat, your legumes, ensuring you're getting your vitamin C in with it? I know some women's supplementation or supplements like those micronutrients and that kind of stuff will have higher amounts of iron, especially if you're taking it different times of the month and what that looks like. But definitely know your body, right? Know what you need a little bit more, need a little bit less. I know there's some work out there with some different people who've done a lot of work on what you need based on your cycle and what that looks like. But we know that from a mental health perspective, this is definitely a driver. As we talked about before, there is a chance you could have some iron overload, right? We know that's something. We know that exists. The gold standard treatment is something called iron chelation. It can be done with a supplement, but I do not recommend this. If you are having iron overload, you need to be working with a specialist, seeing a hematologist, doing a deep dive of why this is occurring. Right now, there is a chance maybe you just consumed a mass amount of iron through a supplement or something like that, and you could take a chelation. But really, you need to be working with a provider to figure out why your iron is so high. Because if it's happening once, there's a really good chance it's going to happen again. And so ultimately, buying these supplements and doing these things aren't very fair to you if you don't know your root cause, right? Same, of course, with the iron deficiency. Looking at your diet, seeing what this looks like, all those things are important. And then working with these hematologists and these other physical providers can be really, really important. However, in the world of mental health, we know iron's important, right? And so if you find yourself having a lot of weakness and fatigue, maybe you find yourself having brittle nails, or you want to eat very abnormal stuff like dirt or paper or whatever that looks like, there's a really good chance you may have an iron deficiency, right? And so just supplementing with a little bit of iron can be helpful. It's better to get those labs done, but there is something to be said for that iron ferrous glycinate or biglycinate rather that can be really helpful to you, right? So if you take anything away from this, make sure you're knowing your iron if you're feeling unwell. Getting it checked out can be really important. If you're consuming iron, right, making sure you're getting your vitamin C. If you're worried about your iron, ensuring you're eating the foods that are very high iron at the same time as eating those vitamin C foods as well to ensure you're increasing the absorption and all of that. I've enjoyed this. Thanks for sitting with me today. I think that this is really interesting because there are a handful of people, right? There are a chunk of people who are maybe experiencing mental health issues driven to this, right? And so if you find yourself and a lot of this resonates with you, check it out. If you know somebody else who's struggling with it, maybe mention it to them, but definitely getting checked out by a functional provider, just a primary care, whatever that looks like, to check your levels to really know. Thanks for being with me. Continue this path of healing and whatever that looks like for you. And thanks for joining the show.